And I have tried to think about what I would do to begin with, and I thought I'd lay a foundation because you actually have really competent people coming up behind me, and I thought maybe my best skill would be to try and lay a foundation and maybe some questions at the end that would open up and be answered possibly by some of the discussion that comes up. So what I plan to do is to talk about some of the significant changes that we've seen in our global economy, and try to tie those into the trade system and trade structure, and then think about at the end, mostly questions, but lay out the fundamental issue of what should trade policy look like given the economic condition that we're in, okay? I hope that's okay because I don't have time to change it. We're here. So let me begin and say two apologies right up front. One is to apologize for the translators because sometimes I'm a little bit hard to follow, so I apologize right in advance on that. And secondly, I'm going to grind through a lot of numbers. Now, there are three kinds of economists, those that are good with numbers and those that aren't. And I generally consider myself in the second category, but you'll get this later. Generally, I think I need to lay out some numbers that show us where we are in the economic situation, the large global financial situation, if we're going to understand how emerging markets are going to be able to respond and develop from this. So let me walk through this rather grisly picture, if I might. As I thought about this, I thought, my gosh, what interesting times we're in. And I always heard about the ancient Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. I looked this up. In fact, it was never written in Chinese. It was written by a journalist in the United States in 1938. But it still applies here. These are terribly interesting times. And when I say interesting, I mean complex, uncertain, and perilous. And I don't think they've ever been as interesting or as perilous as they have since Bretton Woods, as they are now. These are difficult times. And we can't really work on other things, I think, until we get a good handle and good sense and some correction to the financial problems that the globe is having. As Lord Keynes said in a letter to Lord Addiston in 1994, quote, "It is very difficult, while you have monetary chaos, to have order in any other direction." So we need to get our monetary chaos back in order before we can start working on the other areas of the economy. So what are some of these interesting times? I'm going to go back about 30 years because I'm old enough to do that. But if you look at some of the changes that have taken place, bringing in China, Russia, India, and Brazil into the marketplace. They were not in the marketplace, but bringing them into the marketplace brings about 1 billion new active, energized workers into the competitive marketplace that the developed countries then have to deal with. And if you start thinking about Indonesia and Turkey and Mexico, another several 100 million workers coming into the workplace. You have the fall of the Soviet Union and the reestablishment of the Russian hegemony in Eastern Europe, reestablishing through trade agreements and soft power through the domestic elections, a new formidable second world power now under Russian control, with a strong hand on many precious resources, including energy for Europe. So this is a very particularly powerful group. You have the development of the Uruguay round and establishment of a beginnings of a rule of law for commercial activity that has been quite successful and changed the way countries interact with each other in a trade way. And one way to think about this is the growth of the dispute settlement process, which just creates a legal framework. Over 405 barriers to trade have been taken to the WTO and resolved in one way or another. You have, in addition to that, 420 free trade agreements now arising that have been reported to the WTO. This doesn't even include all of them, just the members of the WTO. So you have a whole different structure of how these countries are interacting with each other. Despite this nice institutional structure, we still have crises that are arising. We have an oil crisis. Within 1 year, we saw oil prices go from $50 a barrel to $147 a barrel, and then back down to $63 a barrel, all within 12 months. As a consequence of that, we had a food crisis, partly as a consequence, because all the subsidies are going into food as a replacement for oil. So we had a food crisis. Prices rise, people are suffering, and governments are intervening in their markets to prevent exports so that they can control prices. And then on top of that, we have the Great Recession, which has now become such a dominant force of what we're thinking about. No one has been untouched, and it is not as bad as the Great Depression. Trade hasn't been as badly affected, but it is still a grisly place to be, and we are not dealing with it as well as we could, understandably. Simon Johnson from MIT has put it nicely. He says, the political process to deal with this is going at a 20th century pace, while the markets are moving at a 21st century global networked pace. So governments aren't able to keep up with this. And there are some positive signs, but there is much to be feared in this perilous time. Let me give you just a few of the numbers. Banks now are reluctant to loan. Consumers are reluctant to borrow. More than 15 million U.S. homeowners are underwater. That is 18% of all the people that own homes in the United States owe more on their homes, or owe more on their homes than their homes are worth. 18%. The U.S. faces a $1.5 trillion commercial real estate refinancing dilemma. $1.5 trillion in distressed real estate has to be refinanced over the next 5 years. The Pew Foundation has just put out a study that says that the various states in the United States have over $1 trillion in unfunded pension liabilities. Somewhere they have to come up with this money. Europe is not much better off. It's no better off, in fact. The European banks appear to be in worse condition than we are. Estimates are that 1.4 trillion in damaged assets have yet to be acknowledged or recorded as losses. The EU faces a banking crisis that could lead to some speculative problems. Johnson, again of MIT, estimates that the Eurozone is going to be under tremendous threat. They're going to have a very, very low growth rate by the end of this year. Bill Gross, managing director of PIMCO, calls it a nitroglycerin of debt underneath the markets. And Simon has said that there could be a speculative run on European banks. Okay. It's not at all clear how the Chinese banks are doing. Yes, their growth is going well, being stimulated, but Stratfor has estimated that 95% of the growth is a result of the stimulation package of about $600 billion, or 16% of China's GDP, or possibly $1 trillion. We're not exactly sure how much has been spent. All of which, or most of which, has gone to loans for which the quality of the loan has not been taken into account. So there is tremendous uncertainty and peril with the development that has gone into China. They are taking steps to control it, but it is not at all clear they'll be able to do this. We hope they can, but it's not clear that they'll be able to. In addition, China has built into it a very inefficient use of its capital because it is not generally market-oriented, market-based. It is very often politically based. So they, like some other Southeast Asian countries, face an inefficient use of their capital that may be a serious problem. We hope not, but it may be a serious problem. Financial intermediation over the last couple of years has been easy to do, lots of money moving in and out, and this has proven to be a pretty good thing in many instances. Money is available for development and growth. Money is moving around the globe in an efficient way and looking for its most productive or possibly just its most profitable uses. And many countries have done very well as a result of this, particularly some of the Southeast Asian countries. On the other hand, capital has proved fickle and volatile. And it moves in quickly, and it moves out quickly. And this was last seen easily in the Southeast Asian crisis. And as a result, We have had some policy changes in some of those countries that have been trying to make their system more efficient and effective and safer, but which has added to a large global imbalance that has contributed to the current Great Recession. Very clever, smart on their part. Money flew into Southeast Asia, and it flew out quickly. In the 10 years going up to the financial crisis in Southeast Asia, the Southeast Asian countries had an average current account deficit of 1.7% of GDP. Coming out, they have changed their policies, they have increased their savings, they have controlled their currencies, and they have increased their emphasis on exports, and now have an average current account surplus for the last 10 years of 2.5%. A fairly large shift. Along with China, of course, which has a tremendously large surplus. All of this is good because then they can finance a lot of the expenditures and investments that are going on in the developed world. But you have, as Moritz Schlarek says, a great deal of money flowing uphill. And the problem is, at some point, when that money stops, then you run out of money for the people that are borrowing. Trade was booming. Resources were being allocated effectively. Productivity increased at a level higher than, except for a few years, than for the last quarter century. So the system was working quite well until, of course, it collapses. And it collapses fairly quickly because of the increased technology and the creativity of all this money coming in from these private and sovereign funds flowing uphill and being used by very bright, very thoughtful, mathematically oriented, computer literate people seeking higher rates of return and coming up with very creative and innovative financial intermediation, all of which then collapsed fairly quickly. As grim as this all seems to be, I think it might even be worse. And we have to deal with this. Worse in what way? Well, the crisis was the result of massive private debt. And the cure was to turn it into public debt. And so now we have a huge layer of public debt that we are not quite sure what to deal with. Coming up over the next year or so, very soon actually, the Federal Reserve Bank will have to sell off as much as $2 trillion in financial assets. And unless this is handled exactly right, and as bright as Ben Bernanke is, this is uncharted waters for us. Unless it's handled exactly right, it is very likely to reverse the current trend, the current growth, recovery, or unleash ruinous inflation. Either way, we have much to fear as we look ahead. According to a recent estimate by the Office of Management and Budget, the net federal debt is $5 trillion, and by the end of this year will be double that, just about $10 trillion. It is hard to imagine the United States defaulting. It did in 1993 when FDR seized the gold supply. It's hard to imagine here, but not impossible. Not impossible. And if there is even a perception of a default or a reduction in the credit rating for the United States, that in fact could lead to quite substantial problems. And we have estimates from OMB, the Concord Coalition, and CBO that we're expecting on a long-term basis the net federal debt to increase, the net federal deficit to more than double, and the debt, some projections from CBO put the federal debt by 2030 at about 181%, and by 2050, 321% when you count in the entitlement problems and the Medicare problems and the healthcare problems. All of this was nicely wrapped up for me as the grim part of this by Niall Ferguson, who wrote in the Federal Foreign Affairs this latest journal. In fact, I read it on my flight up here. But let me quote from him for a moment. He says, "The next phase of the current crisis may begin when the public begins to reassess the credibility of the monetary and fiscal measures that the Obama administration has taken in response to the financial crisis. Neither interest rates at zero nor fiscal stimulus can achieve a sustainable recovery if people in the United States and abroad collectively decide overnight that such measures will lead to much higher inflation rates or outright default." empire.